So my name is Madeline Neighly. I'm a senior policy advisor at the Council of State Government's Justice Center and focus on criminal records, fairly often with the crossover into employment, but more generally collateral consequences. And this morning I'm joined by a great panel. We're going to do really just name and titles and they can give a brief introduction. So I'll start to my immediate right, and this is Dorothy Chou, Chou, although everyone says something different, right? Okay, so I'm off the hook. Is the head of public policy for consumer protection, safety, and self-driving with Uber.
Hi everyone. In my work, basically what's happened is I've looked at the different criteria that it takes for people to be able to sign up for Uber. It's been really interesting to realize that a lot of the laws around who can and can't drive and the background checks that we're asked to do fall into different categories and also don't necessarily make sense. The offenses that we're pushed to disqualify people for, forced to disqualify people for, aren't necessarily relevant for driving. And so I'll be talking a little bit more about the changes that we've made and working with governments to really proactively be able to get more and more people to have a fair chance to be able to drive with us.
And to her right is Genevieve Martin, who is the executive director at the Dave's Killer Bread Foundation.
How many of you have heard of Dave's Killer Bread? Okay, it's a little better than the last panel. So we are the #1 selling sliced organic bread in the country and across Canada. We are almost 12 years old, and 1/3 of our workforce have felony convictions. It's something that we've been really proud of and celebrated for a very long time. And about 4 years ago, we decided we had the duty to do more. So we embraced this part of our workforce, we really celebrated their successes, and it kind of ended there. And so we realized that we should understand a little bit more about reentry and incarceration and what that process looked like for each individual and figure out how we could better support them. And that's when we very quickly realized employment was the place that we needed to focus. So we created the foundation. We worked directly with other businesses and advocates to talk about how you implement second chance employment within the workforce and embrace that talent pipeline that so many people overlook.
To her right is Michele Sedney, who is the Senior Director for Central Recruitment Services for the Johns Hopkins Health System Corporation. And as you introduce your role, I think it's really helpful to introduce what the Johns Hopkins Health Systems Corporation is, because there are so many pieces.
Yeah. Good morning. The Johns Hopkins Health System Corporation encompasses all of our hospitals and our healthcare insurance arm, our community physician practices, and our home care groups. So we have 4 hospitals in Maryland, 1 in Washington, D.C., and 1 in Florida. So in my role as Senior Director of Recruitment and kind of overseeing all of those services, the processing of employees falls within that bailiwick. And our commitment to giving people second chances goes back, I would say, 15, 20 years. And it partially stems from when Johns Hopkins left the money to build the hospital. He very clearly stated in his last will and testament that we were to take care of the indigent, the sick, the poor, those people who could not take care of themselves. And in being one of the largest employers in Baltimore itself, our presidents have always felt a strong commitment that if we're not going to be able to give jobs to those people who are in need, then nobody else is going to do it. And also from a business standpoint, when we did start doing background checks back in, 1999, 2000, and saw that, there are a lot of people that have, criminal convictions. If we're going to exclude every single one of them from employment, we will never be able to staff our hospitals. So from the mission, from Johns Hopkins, as well as from the business perspective, and our commitment to giving people second chances is why we do what we do.
Thank you. And to her right is Mark Holden, who is the Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary of Koch Industries, President and COO of the Legal Division of Koch Companies Public Sector, and
That's good.
There's more, right?
No,
there's a lot. So also,
Yeah.
Can you explain those different roles and the different parts of the organization?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I've worked with Koch for 22 years, and I don't know if there's that big a difference between the 2 titles. I had 2 titles, 1 salary.
You should talk to somebody about that.
What's that? Yeah, I tried. It didn't work. Anyway, it's great to be here today, and we're passionate about criminal justice reform at Koch Industries. It's a big issue for us. It's to create a more free and open society and to remove barriers to opportunity for everyone. If you believe in that, which we do, if you believe in equal justice, which we do, if you believe that a lot of what has happened in our criminal justice system is unfair and contrary to the Constitution and immoral and fiscally ruinous like we do, then you'd be a fan of this, I think, of criminal justice reform. So that's why we're involved in it. Our goal is, like I said, to remove the barriers to opportunity wherever they may be in our system. And the criminal justice system, as we all know, people in this room know, creates sometimes immovable and permanent barriers to certain, particularly the poorest among us and the least educated among us. And we've seen that happen the last 30, 35 years. So we're trying to reverse that trend. I'm with Koch, so we believe in limited government, and we see a lot of failed big government programs everywhere, and the criminal justice system, in my opinion, is Exhibit A. And I'm not saying people don't have good intentions, but we've created a system that's gone way beyond what it should be used for. And I'm sure they've talked about this yesterday, and you've heard it before me saying it, but we use our criminal justice system. It's an abuse of the system, and it's the key institution of our criminal justice system is being abused to deal with things that really aren't criminal a lot of times. And so whether it's mental health issues, whether it's just indigent people, whether it is a public health crisis like drug usage, whatever it might be, we've decided instead of trying to address those issues in a more productive way over the last 30 years, although it is changing, we decided to use our criminal justice system. And that, in our opinion, is contrary to why you have a criminal justice system, particularly in a free society where 40% of our natural rights, the Bill of Rights, deal with criminal justice issues and our rights under that system. You should only use the criminal justice system. You should only take away someone's life, liberty, property, in pursuit of happiness in extreme circumstances. And you should use the least amount of force necessary in a free society to bring about compliance. We've got that all backwards now. We want to try to help correct that. There's a lot we can talk about today. Last thing before we get started, we have been, since I've been with Koch for the last 22 years, we have always hired people who had criminal records. We banned the box a few years ago, but before we banned the box, we followed what the EEOC recommended, which is to consider a criminal record as one factor in the person's whole story. Don't overly fixate on it. Look at the recency or how long ago the crime was committed, what was the crime, and what are you hiring the person for, what role are they interested in. And with that lens, it's helped us really expand, to your point, the applicant pool, because we're in a global talent hunt with 120,000 people around the world that we need to employ. And if you believe the statistics, 1 in 3 people in this country have some type of criminal record, which is more people with criminal records than college degrees in our country, which is pretty amazing. But if you're going to exclude a third of the potential workforce just because of that, it's really short-sighted as an employer, and it's not fair to the individuals, and it's really going to hurt society at the end of the day. Because regardless of what you think of people who commit crimes, everybody deserves a second chance, and 95% of the people coming out, we all have a vested interest in helping them get better once they're out.
Thank you. So we heard from everybody a little bit about why they're in this game and why they care about it, and Mark really opened up the next part of the conversation, which is how. How do each of these organizations consider criminal histories, and how do they process that, which I think will be a jumping off point for discussing how so many folks in here who are service providers can help prepare their clients for that process. So if each of you wouldn't mind talking about how your company considers background checks, and I know that we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between a regulated position, for which there might be state oversight on background checks, and not, and just kind of tease out some of those threads.
Sure. So Uber is really interesting because driving for a living is actually a regulated business. So what that means is that state governments and local governments alike may set the background check standards that are required for somebody to be able to drive with us. And it's a huge patchwork. Everybody has different ideas about what should be disqualifying, what shouldn't be disqualifying. But the interesting thing about Uber is that we want an unlimited amount of drivers. So you aren't competing with anybody else for the role as long as you can pass the background check. So that's what makes the background check so important. what we've done is we've realized that, like I mentioned before, that when I joined the company 2 years ago, I started looking at the standards around who can drive and who can't. And we brought in some community groups to really understand what the impact was on the communities that we were serving. And it was interesting to us because many of the communities of color said, well, if this is the criteria, I can't drive. And so that was really heartbreaking for us. And so we looked particularly at our home state of California. So we're based in San Francisco. And they had passed Proposition 47, which was reducing a number of felonies to misdemeanors in order to help people get back on their feet. And so we thought, well, you know, if the public voted on this, and they're all in favor of it, then we should be able to align our disqualification criteria in California with Prop 47. So we did 3 things in February 2015. The first was we notified everybody who we had disqualified, who had an eligible offense for Proposition 47 to tell them that you could reduce your records. There was a 2-year limit, actually, for some reason, on how, like, the limit of time that you could petition to have your records reduced. So we notified everyone. The second thing we did was we changed our criteria in California to align with Prop 47. So a number of offenses, for example, check fraud, non-violent, non-sexual offenses. So check fraud, graffiti on Halloween, for example, minor property damage, all of those things that would previously have been disqualifying were no longer disqualifying. And the third thing we did was, the reality is there are still going to be people who cannot drive with Uber because of the laws that exist. Mostly, I would say, around their driving records. So we look at your driving history. If you have a DUI, you cannot drive with us. We notified everybody who could not drive with us and let them know that there are services out there that can help them. So we've been partnering with different advocacy groups and support groups to be able to help them find opportunities that suit them. The results have been really interesting, and I think one of the most important parts of the conversation around reentry is about data. What is the data that shows me that people with records aren't a threat to the business? And I should say it was a tough conversation internally when we made this decision because it does have an impact on the brand, or they thought it would have it. People internally were nervous it would have an impact on our brand, especially around safety. But what we've seen is that over 6,900 people have now signed up to drive with us in California who previously could not. They actually have the same exact average rating as their counterparts in California, so all around 4.8. Which is interesting because that's a proof point for us that the quality doesn't diminish when you actually onboard people with minor records. And so we've been working a lot with other states to think more and more about, can we make these changes? Last fall, we made the same changes in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Mississippi, all states where we had a little more leeway in the regulations to be able to do that. And what we found is that people really love driving with Uber, mostly because when you're getting back on your feet, you need something that's really flexible. You need something that works around, education opportunities, other job interviews, picking up your kids. And it worked well because, in the United States, more than 50% of our drivers drive less than 10 hours a week. So they're really just fitting it around their schedule to make ends meet. And, we're so thrilled that we've seen some of these results, and we're excited to keep working with other state and local officials and advocacy groups to make this a reality in different places as well.
Ours is way easier. So to be a commercial baker, there's no licensing, none of that. We do conduct background checks on every person that works for us. However, that's generally more used as an integrity check. We accept people on a case-by-case basis. There are no crimes that we would say no to. It's completely based on your fit within the team that you're being hired for. That's something that tends to frustrate community organizations, as Michele spoke to yesterday, and we've seen that too, as far as everybody wants to know, okay, what will you take, what won't you take, what's the time frame, and we can't give you that. And any employer that will, I would probably question that reasoning a little bit, because it's really based on the individual and how they fit within your team. What were the other questions that went with that?
So I think we wanted to talk about the difference between a regulated position and unregulated, and how does your background check process work? I think you've covered it. You're good. Yeah, we'll come back to you.
Pretty straightforward.
So certainly in the healthcare industry, many of our positions are regulated by the licensing boards, and the licensing boards do conduct background checks and fingerprint checks. So in those cases, if the licensing boards are going to give somebody a license, that's half the battle, is that you've got your license. Beyond that, when we We banned the box a few years ago. We probably could have asked for an exception because we're dealing with vulnerable patients. But we made a conscious decision not to ask for an exemption on that because it, in our minds, it shouldn't matter whether you have a criminal background. We want all the candidates to be seen based upon what are the skills and experience and background that you can bring to the table to help us be a better, provide better services to the patients that we serve. And so all of our, people get screened. If their application gets forwarded to the hiring manager, they're interviewed. Hiring manager comes back and says, please extend an offer. That offer is extended. It's a conditional offer of employment. At that point in time, we would then ask them for authorization to do the background check and the references and occupational health and things. Probably what's really unique that we do at Hopkins is that we use an outside vendor to do the background checks, but we get daily emails with here's all the people that had hits on their backgrounds, convictions on their backgrounds. And we actually hired a former Baltimore City police officer, and he used to be a former member of the Johns Hopkins security team, who is as an actual member in HR. He works for me, and he reviews all of those hits on the backgrounds. And he does a thorough review in line with the EEOC guidance in terms of what is the conviction? How is that relevant to the position for which they're being considered for? How old were they at the time of the occurrence? How long ago was it? What have they been doing? If they got out of jail recently, what have they been doing? We'll look at references. If they've been working, have they been steadily employed, and are they getting good references? So we really take an individualized approach and review. And we do really frustrate the community service providers that we work with because they want a list, they want a matrix, and we say we can't give you one because we absolutely don't have anything that we don't consider because we look behind, and because he's has been in security, sometimes he can look into the case files that are accessible to be able to learn a little bit more. It's also really helpful because none of us are attorneys, none of us have been in law enforcement, and if you've ever read a background check, some of the convictions and how they're worded, could sound really bad to me, but it might not really be serious, and something that doesn't sound serious is actually really bad. And so Joe is who works for us, and he's great because he'll review everything, he'll send a recommendation, and I'll be like, Chou, I don't know about this, and he'll come sit in my office and go, look, this is what it means. And he can recently he said to me, you can get charged with and convicted of this if you're just sitting in the car with somebody else who has drugs on them. You don't have drugs on you, whatever, and that's what this that's what this conviction was or whatever. So that's really, really helpful for us. And he does this for every single hospital and entity that we have within the health system. Because before he was in that role, each individual entity in the HR department was making those decisions. And within the health system corporation, each of the individual members of the corporation are individual employers. They're separate employers. So if I wanted to transfer from Johns Hopkins Hospital to Johns Hopkins Bayview, even though it's an inter-affiliate transfer, I'm still processed as a new hire, and a new background check would be run. So maybe Johns Hopkins Hospital previously said, yes, we would accept that background, and they hired them. But, years ago, Johns Hopkins Bayview, when I wanted to transfer, would look at that and say, oh, no, that's not acceptable to us. And that didn't make sense. They're working in our system already, and it was found acceptable by one. Why not the other? So it made sense for us to kind of centralize the review and the recommendations. And each individual hospital has the right to not accept the recommendation, but I would say 99% of the time, they are in agreement with his recommendations, and we move forward. And I can say that for the individuals with backgrounds that we've hired, we, knock on wood, I mean, we have not had any issues. When there are people on staff who've been involved in things that happen on campus, whether it's theft or drug diversion, there's normally a risk assessment team that gets together, and we normally get a call from the risk assessment team that says, we want to see a copy of this person's background check when they were hired. Well, in all the times that they've asked for that, that person has never had any convictions on their background. It's not the individuals with the convictions that are the ones who are getting into trouble. So that's really kind of eye-opening for us.
Our system's really simple. We try to hire the best person for the role. And so we post a role, an open role on our website, and people apply. Like I said, we don't have the box on our application, so we get all the resumes or applications. Then we look at those resumes and applications, then we figure out who we want to do a phone screen of. We do that, and if that person seems good, he or she's invited into the facility or headquarters, wherever they'll be working, and they'll be interviewed by the teams and HR that they're working with. And then, based on that, we'll make a conditional offer of employment, which is when we do our background check. And as part of the background check, it picks up any prior criminal history. And at that point, generally speaking, in our experience, people usually front that issue. They don't wait for the background check. And I'd recommend that everybody do that. And that's just part of the person's story. And just the way we look at the world, what we've seen in our experience at Coke with the criminal justice system, what I've grown up around, where I'm from in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I worked in a prison. For a couple years as a guard when I was in college. I worked as a janitor where my coworkers were all guys on work release. So I've always been around it seems. And so to me, a criminal record, I'm not gonna say it's not a big deal, but it really doesn't freak me out. And we've hired people with different types of felonies, misdemeanors, and it all depends on the circumstances. We want to hire the best person for the job. And we do it not because we're such awesome people, I think we are, but we do it because it makes sense for our business at the end of the day. And we've hired people with criminal records who are great employees. They're humble, they're hungry, they need a chance, they're loyal. And we've hired people with criminal records that don't work out for whatever reason, not because they commit a crime, they're just not the right fit for the job. But we've hired a lot more people who went to all the fancy schools and had the best recommendations and job histories, who are the worst employees in the world in a lot of ways. They're entitled and whiny, some of them stole from us. So, if you've, again, it's one of these issues. Brian Stevenson talks about being proximate to an issue. If you're proximate to this issue, and particularly about who goes to prison in this country and for what, and how the system's set up from beginning to end, from the laws that are passed to how cases are prosecuted to the fact that 80% of the people in the system need a court-appointed lawyer, and we know that court-appointed lawyers are usually not available because they're not funded, even though it's a Sixth Amendment requirement that they are funded. And we know who gets the longer sentences, and we know people plead guilty to things they didn't do because they can't afford to fight the government. And we know that these long sentences exist, and then we know that inside prison, nothing's really happening to make people better, but they're coming out. Well, why not try to help them as well? There is an aspect of that. And the reality is, you end up, it's win-win-win. It's a win for the employee, the individual who needs a chance. It's a win for us. We get a good employee. And it's a win for society, because people who come out of prison and get a job, that's one of the leading indicators, a steady, good job, they will not reoffend. And that's a good thing. That's what our criminal justice system should be about. It should be about enhancing public safety. And how do you enhance public safety? Well, you have rules and laws in place that are equitably and equally enforced. But then there's also people who offend. You give them a second chance. It's about redemption, rehabilitation, and reformation, and not about reprisal, revenge, and retribution. So at the end of the day, with 95% of the people coming out, if you can get them a job and they're good employees, they will not reoffend, and that keeps everybody, including law enforcement, safer. And you look at what's going on around the country. What I've seen, by and large, just the people we deal with who want a job at Coke, people in general, when I'm at these conferences, people just coming out of prison need support and a job. And if they get that, they have a chance. And if they don't, they're probably going back to prison. And that's not good for any of us.
So I heard a couple themes that were also mentioned yesterday, that centralization of the hiring process can really help in applying the standards equally. That an individualized review of folks, when it's not a licensed position or something for which there's a checklist that's regulated by the state, can really allow you to find the right fit. That partnerships, both incoming, community-based organizations that help train or identify folks and refer them to the organization, as well as partnering when somebody's not the right fit or can't get the regulation or license that they need, but partnering to find other positions for them. So one of the questions that I'm thinking about is, we're all talking about the data that you all have that shows that people with records don't make poor employees and don't have higher risks. And Genevieve, you used integrity check, that term, that the point of looking at the record is someone describing it accurately. And that really resonates with me, because people are arrested for one thing, charged with another, convicted of a third, maybe get it reduced with the 17B in California to something else. So how can you be accurate? How can it act as an integrity check if it's so complicated that non-lawyers don't know how to interpret records? And as a lawyer, I often get stumped reading someone's record. So that's one thing that I want to tease out, is what does it mean when these are so complex and so complicated, and we're using them as a integrity check or a barrier when it might be not a lack of integrity, but a lack of comprehension. And second, why are we using background checks then? If they're not indicative of a poor employee, and they are potentially the result of biased policing and biased courts, what do they indicate, and why are we using them? Sorry, we were not prepared for this one, and this is just kind of where the conversation's taking me, so I'm throwing a bomb in here, and we'll see what happens.
Well, we do a background check as just part of our due diligence. And like I said, if someone has a record, it usually gets brought up. If they don't have a record, if they have a record and they haven't brought it up, we'll have that discussion with them. Why don't you bring this up? And sometimes it is, well, wait a minute, that was when I was 14 and it was supposed to be gone. So, but we want to make sure that we're, just like we want to enhance public safety in society, we want to make sure that we're not taking unreasonable risks when we hire people as well. So it's just really, it's conditional employment offers out there, and then it's the last piece we look at. And depending on the role, there may be a credit check, but for a lot of our jobs, we don't do that, particularly with more entry-level jobs. So for us, it's just that aspect of it. And there are times we don't do a background check on people. For example, we've got in Wichita, Kansas, where we're headquartered, we hire people out of the county lockup, so we can kind of figure out they already have a criminal record if they're in the county lockup. And then in one of our facilities in Texas, Georgia Pacific, one of our subsidiaries, has started to hire people who are close to coming out of prison, like 8 to 10 people, to have them come in and work there as well. But by and large, it's just kind of the uniform way we go through our process. And there are some roles that we have because we have refinery and chemical plants where there are some restrictions on that, so we have to do it. And then the last piece I'd say is, and this is something that we'll probably get to, what can the government do? There's a lot the government can not do anymore that would be very helpful in the whole system. But there are a lot of employers who are concerned about liability, in the sense if something does happen and they haven't done their diligence, they could be open to a negligent hiring or reckless whatever type lawsuit, and nobody wants that either.
In the healthcare industry, the hospitals are regulated by the Joint Commission, and the Joint Commission does require background checks. So that's one of the reasons that we do them. But also, I really think that it's a balancing act for us at Hopkins, because we're balancing the safety of our patients, the staff, the visitors, with giving individuals an opportunity for a second chance. And so, that's a hard balancing act sometimes. So we do take the background check very, very seriously. We do ask the individuals, once that conditional offer of employment is made, to do a disclosure to let us know, now that you've been offered this job, we're going to run the background check. Are we going to find anything? And we do take it seriously. Are they going to be honest with us about that? But I will say that there are many, many individuals who have convictions or things on their records that they thought were either, had been expunged. Some people don't even know that they have something, on their record, and it's kind of amazing. And so I really think that sometimes we go above and beyond so that, since we have this former police officer working for us, he has been very helpful to individuals who said, oh my gosh, I never knew I had this on my record, and he has kind of walked them through the steps of what they needed to do and how to do it. And so that's been very helpful. But I mean, that's the reason that we do the background checks, but is because of the licensing requirement and the balancing of the safety and security of the patients and visitors and staff.
I think just to echo those same points, even though we don't have licensing for folks, it is part of due diligence. So we know that when we talk with a lot of employers, they talk about insurance being something that would be a holdup in the process to embracing people with backgrounds, which really doesn't need to be the case. But a part of that process is, in fact, being consistent among all of your practices and demonstrating that you have best employment practices across the board for all people in all ranks in your organization. And so it's a very simple practice to do a background check as a part of that layering process. When I talk about integrity check, often we know where our folks are already coming from because they're coming from a recruiting pipeline that, it might be community corrections in our local area, or they're coming to us from another person that said, hey, I was locked up with this person. So we kind of know going into it. So when people are really open about it in the very beginning, we prefer that because that's also how we get our best possible candidates, is when we've gotten to know that piece of you and we can discuss that and see a couple of things which are really important. And that is first that you've taken ownership for the actions that you participated in, what those were. And that you're also able to demonstrate what you've done since to be a person that's making better choices and trying to get your life on the right track. Have you taken advantage of other programs maybe while you were incarcerated, or if those were not available to you, as they so often are not, what have you been doing since you came back to the community to be making those good choices? And so it really acts as a conversation starter for us. In the event that they don't match up, because background screenings are not one and the same, they are very much you get what you paid for. They vary state to state, county to county. It's kind of a disaster, honestly. It also gives that individual an opportunity to potentially correct anything that's there that may not be accurate. We've seen that many times when, to your point of somebody that may have committed a crime as a youth, those are supposed to be sealed at a certain point. So they say, oh no, I don't have a background, because they were told that they don't. After this period of time, we run a background check and we go, hey, it's still dinging you. You're gonna want to address that. That doesn't mean you don't get to work for us, but it is a part of that process of kind of full circle, working with that person to set them up for the best possible success.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I mean, with Uber, we're regulated by state and local governments, so we are required to run a background check. But we do believe the background check is important for violent offenses, sexual offenses, and driving offenses. Those are things that we believe are relevant to the role. But what we've been really doing is focusing on working with state and local governments to make sure that criteria is both relevant and fair. A lot of times people don't connect the fact that things like ride-sharing regulations have an impact on reentry. They're not making that connection. What policymakers tend to think about is, well, when a crash happens, am I going to be able to say, well, I did everything I could to keep everybody safe? And so you have to be able to have the conversation where you're saying these regulations for these various industries, and it's not just ride sharing, it's a lot of licensed businesses, regulated industries. Those things all have a connection to reentry. So we really push policymakers to be thinking about that and really holding up their commitments to criminal justice reform. The other thing we've seen is a lot of times there's questions about, should you only look at convictions or should you start looking at arrests? And when you're looking at arrests, obviously there are very biased consequences because of the history of policing in our country. And so we've been really pushing for only looking at convictions, only using the types of background checks that will take convictions into consideration instead of just arrests. And the third thing we ask them to consider is the look back period. how far are companies like us forced to look back in somebody's history for these various offenses? You know, the FICRA at the federal level talks about how it should be just around 7 years. I think the EEOC recommends the same thing. But we have seen states come at us and say, we want you to look back their entire lifetime for very minor crimes, and those things should be disqualifying. So I would say, you know, we think a lot about how we can tailor that background check with the governments so that they can be relevant and fair to the task at hand.
Thank you. So one thing that we talked about yesterday and that I think it's helpful for people to know is that the Council of State Governments Justice Center is working on a new clearinghouse called the Clean Slate Clearinghouse, and the site is cleanslateclearinghouse.org. I'm sorry, it's very long. It's launched now, but the main site is going to launch in August. That will allow non-legal service providers and people with records to come and get a general understanding of eligibility for record clearance for sealing and expungement in their state, and then find those legal service providers or other attorneys who might be able to help them access that remedy. It will also provide a deeper dive for lawyers to get the statutory citation and information they need to build more practices, so provide more clinics and more legal services around the country. And finally, it'll allow policymakers and other policy stakeholders to compare and contrast. So be able to look at how many states across the nation allow for felony clearance under 7 years. Are these automatic or petition-based procedures? So that's going to launch in full in August, and I think will really help with this. It's funded by the Department of Labor, actually. So really interesting that labor is really seeing the importance of record clearance in the employment context. So one of the things we talked about yesterday, and given the audience today, I think is really important, is you guys are the employers that are already thinking about this, right? Talk to folks about how best to prepare their clients to come meet not with you, but with an employer who's never had this. And one of the things that was raised yesterday is even if it's an employer in a city or state that has banned the box, a gap on a resume can be indicative of time in prison or something that someone's going to have to answer to. So how do you suggest that service providers really can work with their clientele to send them out with the best foot forward?
Practice. Practice, practice, practice with your folks. Since we embrace this work already, we know firsthand that they may be coming with a slight gap in maybe some soft skills. They may be a little bit more nervous than the next person. And so a lot of employers might immediately go, oh, that's just not the energy I want. So getting people comfortable with their story and with their skills. Another thing that is really important, and you see this in the work with veterans as well, is that these are folks with a ton of skills, a ton of very creative skills, but they don't know how to properly market them. So if you're talking to somebody, and these are a lot of what you'll see come across your HR desk, and somebody that's been involved in substance abuse and selling and distributing, is these are people that are very creative. They know sales and distribution. They know marketing. They know how to manage a team of people. So help them put those skills that they learned on the corner or wherever that was into business terms. Because if they can do that and they can tell that story, that person is going to work hard for you. They're going to walk through walls, and they're going to be some of the best folks that you hire, which is something that we have seen is that folks with felony convictions, and it's not because we place our focus there, they just happen to promote faster than everyone else in our organization, quite honestly. They also perform a little bit better in all 3 disciplinary buckets that we have. We look at attendance violations, policy violations, and behavioral violations. In all 3 buckets, they perform slightly better. That's pretty powerful. I'm gonna leave it at that.
I would echo the practice, practice, practice. Individuals need to feel comfortable kind of telling their story. While we don't, ask on the application about convictions, if there are gaps in employment history, it's going to come up. The interviewer is going to ask, what were you doing during this time frame? And individuals need to feel very comfortable telling their story, and they need to be able to tell their story and tell what they learned from it and how they're ready to move forward. And that's really important, because that conversation can make or break it during an interview. As service providers, the other thing that I would suggest is that as you're working with the organizations, that you really know those clients, that you really know what are the key things that matter to them. In healthcare, service, you need to be very service-oriented and focused. You know, we can teach you some technical skills, but we cannot always teach people to be nice to the patients that we serve. And so, you know, we need people that can work very well with teams, that are very respectful, that are going to go out of their way to do whatever they can to provide a really good experience for people. So you need to know the organization so that you can work with them to really do a good match of people that have those basic skills to go into that organization with.
I don't have much to add beyond what you all have just said, but I think part of it is when I used to do more interviewing, I was always interested in asking the question about what's the biggest mistake you ever made and what did you learn from it? And so any one of us, like I said earlier, could get caught up in the system, and that's just the same question that I'd ask someone who has a criminal record. Even if I didn't know they had it, I imagine they might bring that up. And, you know, again, going back to our philosophy, it's basically a lot of people who get caught up in the system. It could have been, I speak for myself, I easily could have got caught up in the system many times. It's just right place, wrong time, wrong place, right time, whatever the phrase is. So people need to be able to be comfortable. There's a lot of shame. People obviously who have been incarcerated and a lot of shame throughout their lives. They need to be built up and so be able to tell their story in a way that explains it. And it's basically what you were like, what happened, and what you're like now. And then as long as someone's brutally honest and straightforward and they're the right fit for the role, they'll probably get hired.
Yesterday, we had a discussion around Ban the Box, which, as many of you know, is removing that question about criminal history from an initial job application. And over half the states have enacted some form of a Ban the Box policy. More than 150 cities and counties have as well. And these vary. Some of it is simply taking that question off the job application. Sometimes it regulates when an employer can ask, that they have to give a copy of the background check to the person before they question them about it, to go back to kind of this confusion. So they're very different. And we had a discussion about whether they're as effective as we would like them to be. So I want to open it up to what are things that the folks in this room could be asking their cities or counties or states to do that would help pave the way for more employment of people with criminal records? What are, and these again would be, policies or state laws that folks could ask for that would make things easier?
I'll just jump in. I think a lot of what the state, local, federal government can do is to reduce the size of the criminal justice system. And so you could start we could talk about this for hours, but the reentry and reintegration part of it, the reason why a lot of people can't get jobs, can't get housing, can't get loans, can't get occupational licenses, can't get whatever, is because of government restrictions. So the government, in my opinion, throughout the system, they should be looking at more individualized justice. But they need to look at the restrictions that they've placed on people coming out of prison, and do they make sense? Are they individualized, or is it just a lot of them are just blanket block? You have this conviction, regardless, you can't work in this industry, or you can't do this for 10 years. I think that's really short-sighted, and it's unfair, and it's really stupid, and so that should get fixed. So reducing the number of collateral consequences would be something that local, state, and federal governments can do, and I know a lot of them are looking at that. I think that requiring private employers to ban the box, putting more mandates on private employers, I don't agree with. I think if government wants to set an example, they should ban the box on their own employment applications and let private employers make their own decisions. That's my point of view. And I think in general, there's just so many things that the government could do to prevent people from ever coming in touch with the criminal justice system, based on the types of laws we have in place and what we've criminalized and how we punish people. But that's not what you asked. But there's a lot of different things. Well, sure. Just one example. We've got, at the federal level, we don't know how many federal criminal laws we have. anywhere from 4,500 to 6,000. We've got 300,000 plus criminal regulations. And they're the types of things that people could get in trouble for. You wouldn't, driving a Bobby Unser, example. The IndyCar driver was caught in a blizzard and in Utah, and he got lost in the blizzard, found his way out of it. When he came out, he was glad he was alive, and he was prosecuted because he didn't have a permit to ride his snowmobile on the federal lands. That's kind of a ticky-tack thing, but he's got a criminal record now. And, people get misdemeanor, then you get in a bar fight when you're in college. Who hasn't been? I'll say I have been. I didn't get arrested, but who hasn't among us maybe? But if you did, that'd be a felony. And then you sell a dime bag of marijuana, that's 3 strikes and you're out. So the criminal code needs to be reduced. And what we put people in prison for needs to be looked at very closely. The grand jury is a process, in my opinion, is a mess. And the last thing, I hit on this earlier, if we could just really honor the Sixth Amendment, it's required in the Constitution, and people, 80% of the people who come in touch with the system need a court-appointed lawyer. If we could get people lawyers, that would help a lot too, because right now you got prosecutors, and I know a lot of prosecutors do great things, good people, but they're all lying when they say they don't like the power. I don't have much power, I like what I have, but they have all the power. They're judge, jury, a prosecutor, and executioner in some ways. So reducing that would be great, but if they could have a lawyer who could work on their case, people who are relying on court-appointed lawyers, that would make the biggest difference of anything that we could do. So funding, that's important, but the reality is we can't fund schools, we can't fund roads, we can't fund mental health programs. So who wants to fund lawyers for people who have been charged with crimes? But it is a constitutional imperative. And if that were the case, that would probably level the playing field more than a lot of different things. And then just whether it's mandatory minimums or whatever, these one-size-fits-all top-down mandates, we should do away with them. Last thing I'll say, and I'll shut up, mandatory minimums, there's absolutely no data or evidence that show that they reduce crime. There's not. It was all fear and emotion. And prosecutors that I've talked to who were there at the time of the war on drugs started, they admit that. They say, well, maybe 25% is. They don't know. But what we do know is the reforms that have happened in places like Connecticut, thanks to the governor and others, and have happened around the country, have helped reduce crime rates, reduce incarceration rates, reduce spending on incarceration, and have given people second chances. So those are the things our government should be doing.
I'm going to let everyone comment, but did you guys get your marching orders?
Sorry.
Mark
I
gave you a
preachy.
long list to work on, but it's great. And so I think that, and I am hoping this conference is reimagining justice, so thinking expansively. We're not locked into thinking only about reentry solutions that could help folks, although that is kind of the lens that we all are coming at this with. But again, what should advocates and people who care about this community be working towards in their states, and what should they be asking for?
Yeah, I think there's 3 things. The first I would say is I mentioned licensing. So 20 to 30% of jobs require licenses across this country, which means that in most of these cases, there's some sort of required background check similar to Uber. Looking at the criteria in those checks, and 1, making sure that the criteria is fair and relevant, and 2, making sure that those background checks aren't preemptively kicking people out of work when it's not really relevant at all. So for example, if you look at the requirements to become a hair braider in a lot of states, requirements for jobs that basically could really help with the reentry space, we should be thinking about, should these jobs be licensed at all? And if they are licensed, what does that process look like? The second thing, as I mentioned before, what is the mandatory look-back period for these background checks? Is it 10 years? Is it 7 years? Is it 5? How long should somebody have to pay for a one-time mistake that they made, especially a minor one? And looking at the laws around that in various states. The third is a step that I think New Jersey just took 2 days ago, which is looking at expungements. And how that affects the system as well. I think Governor Christie, and there was a bipartisan solution on expungements that was really great in New Jersey. And if you're getting creative, I mean, something I thought about is, the 6,900 drivers in California who now are able to drive because we made criteria changes, who weren't able to drive before and now have a 4.8 rating, same exact thing as their counterparts in California. Should a system like that be able to show that you are rehabilitated or safe for other kinds of work? Can we use things like rating systems really creatively to be able to show, I've done a good job and now I'm eligible for other types of work? in place of things like background checks, because you can use that performance standard to do something really creative and different. It's just an open question.
I love what Mark said, and yeah, I think we could certainly blow up parts of the criminal justice system and start fresh and make it proper. Until that happens, when things are changing, because so much can change and be effective on a more local and state level, and that's where I think all of us have a really important role to play. What I would beg of anybody in that space is that you involve all parties that will be touched by it. We've seen that both in the state of Oregon with Ban the Box, I'll just use it as an example. So often, really great ideas are pushed by a couple parts of a system, but not the entire system, and they're not talking with one another, and they're not understanding how it'll impact one another. So I'll use our state as an example. Our state adopted Ban the Box in January of 2015. They did listen to some voices, but they never actually brought employers as a part of the work group conversation. And it's impacting private employers. So that was kind of a missed opportunity. And then our largest city, the city of Portland, decided they wanted an even stricter Ban the Box ordinance, which I understand why, and I get it. However, private employers don't really like to be told what to do, when to do, and how to do it. And so if you also then completely remove them from the possibility of being a part of that solution, they're certainly not going to receive it well. So whenever changes are happening, thinking about the entire pie that's going to be involved and making sure they're part of that conversation and being ready to have conversations that are tricky and uncomfortable and with people that you're not going to disagree with. But that just means you can get more to the heart of the issue and try to find some common ground together. I think that that is really key as we move forward with, thankfully, a really positive, I think, national stage to work on criminal justice reform, is make sure everyone is involved and find that common ground.
I particularly like the fact that in Baltimore City that they did ban the box, and I think that many other states and cities could encourage to do the same thing, because it levels the playing field for everybody. I don't know this for a fact. I'm making an assumption that there are recruiters out there, there are HR offices that if you put on your application that you have a conviction, that your application may be going one way and everybody else's is going another way, that it levels the playing field for you so that you are really able to present the skills and background that you have that's relevant to the job that you're applying for, and to be able to get an interview based on those merits, and to be able to get a job offer based on those merits. And to me, that's really important. And for anybody involved in making those decisions to go through some sort of unconscious bias training. We've had all of our recruiters go through that training as well, as starting with our hiring managers. In terms of in the area of corrections, I think now is the time that the corrections needs to start looking at, if there are going to be training programs in the corrections area, what are going to be the jobs in demand 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road, and look at what those are going to be and start training for them, so that if training is available, that they're being trained for jobs that people are going to be hiring for at that point in time. I think some of the training programs are relevant and some of them may not be as relevant. And if we know that there's going to be a high demand for certain positions, that's what they should be doing, and that's how we can help those individuals who are incarcerated be prepared to take that next step when they get out.
Thank you so much. So we have a little bit of time. I'd like to open it up to questions. Okay, in the back. Sir, well, yes, okay, sir, yes, you were very quick on the draw.
My name is Charlie, and I'm from Harvard Kennedy School. And a colleague of mine whose office is right next to mine is Diva Pager, and she's done some of the leading research on this. And she presented a
Not yet peer reviewed, but yes.
paper
Yeah.
about the military and about how when they increased, you guys all know it. So.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you guys are open to research. It feels to me like, I know you have data.
She's working with Diva.
We're actually working with Diva.
Because you have, Ms. Chou, what you have is a really interesting thing, which is
Yes.
almost a sort of random places drivers can drive and other places they can't.
Yes.
It could really kind of, so as long as you guys know Diva, I'll shut up and say that.
No, that's great. So we are working with DIVA. We're looking for more businesses to do a combined effort case study to hopefully show exactly what we and our peers have seen, and that is folks with backgrounds perform at least as good, if not better, than their counterparts. So, yes.
I'm done, thanks.
So what DIVA's military study found was that people who got waivers because they normally wouldn't be eligible, given a felony conviction, to be in the military, but during ramping up of U.S. military expansion, they were able to get waivers and they promoted faster through the ranks. So people with felonies did better in the military.
They were dishonorably discharged at the same rate.
Yeah.
Yep.
No more than.
Right. So, yes, ma'am?
Hi, I wanted to thank Mark. I heard a lot of good things, but I want to bring up equal justice. Everyone deserves a second chance. Not all felonies are violent and not all misdemeanors are non-violent. And so whatever the barriers are for felons, the barriers for a person convicted of a sexual offense or people on the registry is twice or 3 times as high and 3 times as wide. And it's one of the grossest misunderstood areas going. So how do we deal with, and the other thing I want to say is I think government should be powers of example. They want companies to come forward and hire people coming out and be incarcerated. Well, I think government should hire them too. And that would be the best incentivization going. But now we have to deal with a public registry. And so certain companies could get threatened. Certain employees may not want to work with a quote-unquote person, I say person on the registry. We're very offended by sex offender. But these are either kids, let's look at it nationally. They could be, I played doctor as a 9-year-old, so in Florida, I'd be on the registry for the rest of my life. I could have looked at child porn, but that's a mental health problem. It's depression, addiction. Or I could have had a Romeo and Juliet romance, and I married my girlfriend, and I'm a sex offender. So I just wanted to ask you as employers, how do you deal with these more complex issues?
I think it's really important for everyone to understand that crime is not black and white. We all come from a family of origin, whatever that is, and it may be a conscious choice or a subconscious choice in how we're raised to believe that someone that commits a crime is a bad person, when it so often is just a person that made a mistake. So I think it's important for all of us to remember that it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray area. To your point, as far as like sex offense in the state of Oregon, it means over 600 different things. And so being able to kind of debunk some of those myths and understanding that on one side of the spectrum is the atrocious, terrible things that our gut tells us when we first hear sex offender. And that's a really hard one to rumble with. But on the other side of the spectrum, it's peeing in a public park. I'm sorry, gentlemen, how many of you have not done that after a long weekend partying? So understanding that this, sorry, it's just, let's just
I legitimately
it's
almost
easier
raised
for
mine.
you. So being able to call just attention to that and being able to have those conversations, because that's a lot to rumble with. There's a lot of those crimes, if we talk about murder and manslaughter, like these are things you have to rumble with in your gut. But when you start to understand, to Michelle's point, that being in the wrong place at the wrong time could get you the same branding as somebody who did actually commit a crime that maybe you personally can't jive with. That's a conversation that has to be had. The public, it's very hard to educate the public. We have 30-second attention spans, and so how to do that in quick, succinct ways is definitely a challenge, and that's something that everybody should be a part of that conversation.
Well, just one real quick thing. I agree with what you said, and this gets back to kind of deconstructing and tearing down some of the rules in place, and again, individualized. So there are sex offenders who need to be dealt with more severely than people who play doctor or, 17-year-old with a 16-year-old who ends up marrying. I mean, all these crazy stories you hear about that are just, as a country, we should be better than this. We should be able to individualize the issues. In Kansas, where I live, they have now put on there, it's for drug offenders too, on their licenses, which I don't quite understand what they're trying to solve for, because most people have to use their licenses when they go into stores. We don't have meth stores in Kansas, so we're not going to, but it's just this over-punitive societal trend, which I think is reversing, but not quickly enough.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm Kitty Tyrell. I went to University of New Haven, Chou Justice Institute. And a particular area of focus that I'm interested in is women, the gender imbalance. And so I'm just curious if anybody can speak a little bit more concretely. Women come out with even less opportunity under our inequity in hiring, even without a criminal history or a criminal record, specific types of crimes that are attributed to women. So I'm just curious, even the Uber company, you know, there's we're hearing a lot of women are seeking those types of opportunities because of the flexibility, but any one of you, what's the focus of your company to look at the gender difference as much as, you know, to some degree, as much as we look at the disparity around, you know, race and ethnicity, socioeconomics? The gender issue is still holding a lot of women back, and it's the issue for women, so I was just asking.
Yeah, it is interesting. When we looked at the 6,900 people who are now driving with us in California who couldn't before, a lot of it is like who takes their first trip when. We see women taking their first trip a lot sooner than men. It's a kind of interesting research thing. We don't really know why yet. I do think it has to do with the fact that it is a great option, right? It's flexible. You can work it around your own schedule. You can pick up your kids. You can drive while they're in school. Like it just fits their lives better. I mean, that goes to a whole issue with women and work in general and how we have to start catering work for women's lives as well. But I think it is really interesting. And I met a woman specifically who, and she's an advocate, and you can actually see her story on uber.com/CJR. That's our criminal justice website. She had been arrested and convicted of drug possession in her 20s. I think it was for marijuana, which is now legal in California. So she did some time for that. Then she ended up having 2 kids. When one of her children was an infant, she was laid off from her employer because that employer decided they were going to fire everybody with a criminal record. So she had no means to take care of herself. She then was stealing baby clothes for her child because babies grow really quickly. And she was arrested for doing that as well, and lost custody of her children, went to jail, got out under Prop 47, and her first thought was, how do I find something so I can get my kids back, because I need them back, that I can work around my schedule. And she happened to be working with a New Way of Life, which is one of our reentry partners in California. And Susan Burton referred her, the head of the organization, referred her directly to us, and now she's driving with us, and she just absolutely loves it. She has another job as well as an advocate for women specifically who've gone through the system. But she works with us. She works with them full time. She drives with us to make ends meet, and it is the perfect opportunity for her. And I have to think that there are more women in that situation who could use the flexibility, frankly, to really suit their needs.
So we have a lot more questions, but I want to throw out to the researchers, and Vinny, this is something that I've been pushing Bruce Western about as well. So I, in a previous career, wrote a report on healthcare occupations in California, and one of the things I found was that CNAs, like a really entry-level position, had over 50 enumerated offenses, which would block you from being able to do that. For physicians, it was a totality of the circumstances. So what I see is, as some prison populations are leveling off or even decreasing, the population of women being arrested and convicted is rising. The licensure occupations that are licensed are fairly often around vulnerable populations. These are traditionally female caregiving jobs, particularly women of color. So what is it that the state is doing where it is both increasingly, there are consequences being put on this population that we also rely on to provide these caregiving occupations, and are putting restrictions there. So somebody look into this, right? Like, there is a lot there. So talk to me. I have so many ideas about this. And sorry, hands and yes, sir.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Jamal Kimbrough, and I heard a lot of good things, and I agree with most of the things that I heard. I really like to commend the panel because you get it. As someone that's formerly incarcerated and now works, with men and women that are returning to the community. And one of the first thoughts that I came in, or the thoughts that I came in with, is that, and teach them, is that how do you take your skills and transfer them? There are a lot of transferable skills that they acquire while they're incarcerated, they're dependable, reliable, and as I go in and work with them a year prior to release, these are things that I talk to them about. In getting employers that understand and get it, that they will be, some of the best employees, and it's very important. Reimagining justice, is the theme, and I'm really gonna try to be brief, but, people that are closest to the problem in the state, the people closest to the problem, the closest to the solution, and that we can't solve the problems in the same mindset that they were created. And I think that's very important to understand the history, because we don't want to chop the tree down and not get to the root. And that, I think it's very important to interpret how did we get into this problem, going back into the transition, the emancipation and the 13th Amendment and what that was really designed to do, and leading up to this point. Because we're dealing with anything else other than those issues that got us here, we'll be, doing the same stuff warmed over. So reimagining justice, really take a step back, and I like to say, just smash it, and find a way. Because I believe that reentry begins at the point of entry, right, and begin to work and shape. And there needs to be, what can our governments do, our local governments, is hold the systems accountable, because we have these jobs out here in these farmlands, that they retire with $100,000 a year pensions on high school diplomas. So I think there's a direct correlation between poverty and, and recidivation, or even being incarcerated in the beginning. And so how certain things get demonized, and these unintentional biases, get incorporated in our learning and in our institutions and our criminal justice thinking, and that whole system that we buy in, and so, being able, the local communities, I think that, we need to look at what our industries are. So each town and city has an industry, the state has an industry, and that the institutions that they're placed in should be developing marketable skills so that these people come back and there's some accountability. I think that there needs to be a type of EAP program for offenders. And we have employee assistance programs, if anybody didn't get that, but specifically ex-offenders to help work out problems, because there's some issues, a lot of issues that, people come into the system that never get addressed. Like you said, somebody said that nothing happens to make people better in the institutions, and that, these community social workers and advocates are the people that can identify and relate and connect to the offenders.
I'm so sorry, we are running out of
I'm gonna
time.
wrap up.
Okay, do you have a question for our
And
panel?
so that EAP program needs to be, I'm looking at solutions, and this is what I'm really about. I mean, we know what the problem is. I've been working with John Martinez and Dyson with the Council of State Government since the 90s. And so this is an issue that's very, important to me. And so, excuse me if I am running over, but it's become the flavor of the day. It's the first time that I think in the history that we've had this kind of dialogue in a commissioner and in the governor that has found this issue important enough to do something about it. And so, yeah, I think that we need specific programs that, if we get credentialed out. And so the last thing that I want to say is that, when we go online and we apply for these jobs, and I think that, being able to look at, how we list a job and what a person's skill set really is, and being able to fit that role. And I think that we need to find another way to look at these individuals
Thank you.
and support them.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
I was just wondering about drug testing. About drug testing. For many jobs, drug testing occurs, particularly for Uber. I mean, we have so many states now where marijuana is legal. What do you, is that still occurring? And with your drivers, they're not coming into a central location. That can affect someone's ability to be driving. I mean, particularly in Washington State and in California, where it's legal. You have people smoking pot all day long. What is, because when I was in the restaurant business for many years, we did drug test all our employees. I don't know why. But we did. Yeah, right. Or wait on you better. I don't know. They probably wait on you better if they're high. But I was just wondering about about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's definitely been something that's been proposed in different states. No state has actually, I think a few states maybe have passed some sort of drug test. I think the hard part is that it's not like you can just pull over someone and use a breathalyzer, right? It's a lot more complicated than that. And not just that, but if you do, a lot of states when they talk to us about pre-employment drug testing, basically, it's totally ineffective. Like, everybody agrees it's ineffective. So we do have to come up with some sort of way to be able to ensure that everybody's safe. Obviously, we have a zero tolerance policy for any sort of driving under intoxication. If you are reported as a driver for any suspicion of either like a smell related to pot, which we have because of the feedback and rating system, we get a lot of feedback all the time. And if we get any feedback that there was a smell of marijuana in your car for some reason, or there's a suspicion that you were driving under the influence, we are going to call you, and we have a zero tolerance policy, which means we do an investigation, we figure out what happened, talk to the rider and the driver. But we don't think that like a pre-employment drug test for Uber makes sense because, one, it's not effective, and two, like you were saying, people drive whenever they want. They aren't just, it's not like a shift. And so it's virtually like if you smoke and you're pretty smart about, when the test is going to happen, you can pretty much game everything. So I think we have to come up with a smarter way of dealing with like the potential for people who are going to be driving while drugged, frankly. But I think that's probably a problem for the state as a whole to solve, and not just for Uber drivers. Because if you're going to drive when you're drugged, you're going to be on the road regardless of whether you're driving with Uber or not, part-time. But it is a really good question, for sure.
We are unfortunately out of time, and I know that there's still a lot of outstanding questions, so I'm going to again beg of my panel to stick around and answer questions and talk to folks if they have the availability. I really appreciate all of your comments and questions. Thank you very much for joining us.